everybody. Good morning. Good to see you guys. Thank you for coming here. It's good to see you all. My name is Seth, like Joel mentioned. I'm the pastor of this community. And if you're new here or have been new here over the last couple months or so, what a time to jump into a church. Thanks for coming. We're really happy that you're here. Probably, I'm sure, it would be a lot nicer to be able to connect more deeply and get to know you a little bit more. Circumstances don't necessarily afford themselves all those opportunities that we might normally have, but we are glad you're here and hope that as the months go by that you do find ways to connect. And Joel mentioned a couple really great ones, helping dive in with meeting some of the needs in crisis of our community, and also with these prayer groups that we're starting up. One of the things that's happened during COVID is I found for myself personally, I can either give all my energy to complaining about what it's taken away, or I can actually ask God, what doors are you opening up? What kinds of things might I do now that I would have either never otherwise would have done, or now can maybe even especially do because of COVID? And we can't do the larger kind of small group gatherings with our normal sort of programming, but it sure seems like God has been wanting to elevate a culture of prayer in our church, especially including people that aren't very comfortable with it or very new to it, don't maybe necessarily feel comfortable praying out loud or in groups and so forth. And so this is a really special moment where we're trying to design groups that are very easily accessible. 15-minute is the minimum. It's like something you'd be like, I need more time than that. Well, it'll take more time than that. But the idea is if 4 people come together for 15 minutes each week, by the end of this year, we will cumulatively have prayed over 100 hours. And here's the best part, you guys. Y'all know God answers prayer? That's a thing. That is totally a thing. If you didn't know that is a thing, that is a thing. So God answers prayer. So we are just deeply looking forward to not just activating people in prayer, but the way that God's going to be responding to it and all the ways it's going to encourage us and even fuel us to want to pray more. When God's people humble themselves, seek Him, and pray to Him, He does extraordinary things. And I think the adventure will only get more exciting from there. So all that being said, text GRACE to 82257. It's a great opportunity to jump in and grow and get really just this viable kind of spiritual deposit in our lives during this otherwise difficult time. With that being said, let's dive into our teaching here this morning, which is on a series called Divided, which is just going right at all the very controversial and divisive issues of our day right now. And we have decided as the leadership of this church, the elders and I and the staff, that it just doesn't make sense to either talk about it indirectly or avoid it altogether, because if we don't, that just means you're going to get your information from YouTube or Fox News or CNN or whatever blog or your friends. And we would rather have a voice in the discipleship of the ways in which we view our world, and especially since the stakes are so high because there are so many fault lines by which people are dividing now, even within families, even marriages, even close friendships are dissolving over some of the bigger issues of our day right now, and we don't want to see that happen in the church, but because we believe the unity of God's people carries incredible power to bring an immense amount of change. So we're just going to go for it. We're going to talk about it and trust God that He's going to help us in the process. Now, that being said, let me throw out a concern that I have here before we dive into our topic for this morning. Well, I started as a lead pastor of this church when I was 27 years old. So I've been in it 13 years. I'm 40 now. And so over the last 13 years, some things have changed. I mean, a lot has changed in the world and in culture in that amount of time. When I was 27, I remember just having a deep fear of God because I knew that what I said, people were going to listen, pay attention to, and actually absorb. It was terrifying to me that 27-year-old with little life experience and what felt like very minimal wisdom was going to proclaim the scriptures to people, and through that, people were going to take that as God's word and as God's truth, and it terrified me. So much so that I prayed a lot, and I sought the scriptures, and I sought a lot of help and wisdom and education and training to make sure that I was faithful from my end to deliver what I really believe was not just Seth's opinions, but God's word as best as I possibly could. That has shifted for me, though. Not that I don't still really care about being faithful with God's word or proclaiming what I feel like is really His heart for His people and not just mine. But over the last 13 years, I don't necessarily carry the major concern that what I say is going to radically impact people and therefore I must be careful. I've actually felt the opposite, that what I say may not impact you at all. That there's been such an erosion of trust, of authority, and especially institutional authority, especially like a pastor of a local church, that it's felt in the last 13 years a shift to where I'm not coming to church to have my thoughts and to have my life shaped by the scriptures in trust of the authority God has placed there through my local pastor, but actually, rather, I'm actually coming to the table with all of my prescribed beliefs and thoughts and opinions about life and the world around me, justice issues, you name it, and I'm just looking for the pastor to agree with me. And if he doesn't, well, then that's my excuse to either tune out or leave altogether. That's a real issue. It's a real problem. Because God has called me, and he has called not just me, but a team of people to lead with authority in this church. And that doesn't mean that we obviously do anything perfectly, but the orientation of relationship, when it's not one of trust and when there's not a heart that's receptive to receive God's word as authoritative, and we're simply just bringing our own prejudices and biases into this moment, then we're not going to be shaped into the image of Jesus, and we're just all going to walk away into the image of this world. And that is tragic. That's absolutely tragic. So my plea is this, that you would listen. And for all of you concerned that you get me as your pastor, I know, me too. I share that concern. I wonder all the time, God, are you sure? Like, are you totally sure about this? And he seemed to be pretty sure. So if you're not here as a part of Committed Grace City, then great. Like, you get to come and kind of filter through and figure out where you're at in the whole thing. Awesome. But if this is your home, then let me just say, would you please lean in? Not just to my voice, but would you really lean into God's word and the text and the scriptures and allow them now more than ever to shape you and form your thoughts? Because he's faithful and he's true, and he doesn't shift with the sands of time. And he has words, I think, that are more relevant and appropriate now as much as they've ever been. So with all that being said, you guys, I want to dive into what's going to be a series of very difficult and challenging subjects in the coming weeks. Pastor Donnell Jones was here last week, and he started on our whole topical riff of this series, talking about the idea of race. And I realized that this is one of the topics that I could just delegate. I've got multiple African-American friends who are pastors who are incredible speakers, better than me, quite honestly, and could just speak this. And as a white dude, like, there's just all kinds of ways in which, like, yeah, there's things I feel like are maybe less powerful for me to say, or maybe not even as appropriate for me to say, and so it would be almost easier to just rest behind them and let them say it all. And I realized very quickly that as amazing as it was to have Pastor Donnell here, and important to have him here, it's a little bit of cowardice to simply delegate entirely and not speak as the pastor of this church to an issue that is very, very significant and important. It's deep to my own personal heart, and as we're going to find here in a moment, I really believe it's deep to God's own heart as well. And so, with all that, I want to be sure that I may not say everything you want me to say or the way you want me to say it. But I do believe God has something he wants to say to us here this morning. And with as much humility as I can muster, I want to be sure to present it faithfully. So all that being said, to talk about race and the church specifically, I want to pose this initial question just to get us going, and it's this question. Is racism a gospel issue? Now, some of you listen to that question, and you might have a no-doubt answer to it, or you might have a complicated answer to it. I've honestly heard a variety of different answers to it, not just here locally in Grace City, but like in the broader body of Christ. It's obviously a big issue that's happening in our culture at large, and Christians are dealing with this issue and have a very complicated relationship with this issue, even throughout our recent, in the last couple generational history of our country. But this is an issue, this is a question, I should say. Is racism a gospel issue? That is actually a really important question to ask. Some of you are wondering what the question even means because it's loaded with a whole lot of Christianism here. And the idea of being a gospel issue means that it's central to the mission of Jesus. It's central to what the good news of Jesus is all about. Meaning if it's central to Jesus' mission, that means it is what the church should be about. If any of you are wondering, the church actually does not have a mission. Jesus does, and he has a church. And so we are those that are to carry out the mission of Jesus, not subjectively determine what we think our mission is as a church. That's already been pre-decided by Jesus, and he's called us to come alongside his mission. So all that being said, this is the big question. Is this part of it? Is racism, or race issues maybe more generally, is it part of the mission the church is actually called to? Now, I've heard a variety of responses that sound somewhat similar to this. This isn't all of them, but it's at least a good representation of them. Next slide. The first one is that some would say that, well, just talking about racism is actually a distraction from the mission of the church. that's supposed to be preaching the gospel. So they would say, is it a gospel issue? Like, no, it's not actually a central gospel issue. It might be an important issue, but the church is tasked with preaching the gospel of Jesus and reconciling people to God and making sure that they're going to be with him in eternity and not separated him from eternity. And that evangelism, discipleship, that's the mission, that's what we do, and anything else is going to be, even if it's a good thing, a distraction from it. Now, I've heard other people say this. No, on the other side, racism specifically and social justice more generally is the primary gospel issue, that's actually the only thing that the church is meant to be about, and there's nothing else greater for sure that the church should ever concern itself with. Still others would go on to say like, oh yeah, for sure it's a gospel issue, but here's the problem with it. Next one. Racism is mostly a thing of the past, right? We've had a pretty horrible history of it in our country. We've made a lot of progression for it, and we still might have some like hot spots that happen here and there and problems with it. But for the most part, it seems like it's a waste of time to talk about racism because it's not nearly as prevalent as it may have once been. And others would say like, yeah, sure, it's a gospel issue, but every time we talk about it, it just seems like it breeds more division. I don't feel like we can do it successfully. It's like it's one of those things that you just, every time you bring up, it's not going to bring people together. It's just going to separate them further. And it seems like, okay, well, we've got some amount of diversity in the church, but the more we talk about race, the fear becomes we're just going to separate even more so than we already are. Now, some of these responses are clearly based out of fear. Some of them are based out of experience. Some of them are based out of theological conviction in maybe one way or another. But I want to, as we kind of work through this, address kind of each of these and maybe a few other thoughts that might go along this line as we consider, is race a gospel issue? Is it central to the gospel of Jesus? And in order to do that, we're going to do what I do probably 70% of the time I ever talk to you guys. We're going to start in the book of Genesis. Because Genesis is where the beginning of God's story is, and we need to understand God's story to see if, how, or where race or racism actually is a part of it. If we're going to just answer the question, is this central to God's mission? Well, then let's look at God's mission. Let's look at the story of God's mission and see if race has been a part of that throughout time and history. So we'll start in Genesis 1, which is probably the first place you have to start when talking about race, because this is where we get the definition of even what it means to be human. In Genesis 1, verse 27, it says that God created humans in his own image. In the image of God we were created. Male and female, he created them. This is before sin. This is before any fall of any kind, before the brokenness in the world. And this is how God made us in his image, which is a deep and profound theological statement and separates us from everything else in all of creation because we have been uniquely stamped with his own image. There's something inherently about us that is significantly like him. And therefore, there is something that God is so delighted about in us that he would share his image with us. It's what separates us from every other creature that exists on the planet. It's why we would even divide from some of the more extreme animal rights activist groups to say there's a difference between animal life and human life because humans have been made in God's image and there's something sacred and beautiful about that. Male and female, no distinction, and across nations and ethnicities and cultures and any boundary you'd ever want to create, all that is still true of every human that has ever lived. They are made in God's image. That is why we can say without any sense of doubt that humans are made with a sense of dignity, worth, value, and equality. And any violation of that through degradation, through oppression, or anything even resembling racism is not just an affront to humanity, it's actually an affront to God himself. This is where we would also, this is where the church has an obligation to speak up because as the culture carries on about issues of race and justice and rights and equality and all these other things. There's plenty of things that they get right and that are important, but the problem that culture will always run against is that they are never going to find a true, logical, foundational support for everything that they claim is just and right. Why are all people equal? Well, because we feel like they are. Because they just are. Because we all just kind of know that they are. Well, I don't know about you, but my feelings change quite frequently. And as I look back over the course of history, people have had different feelings about that. So are we just going to go off of what our internal sense is right now, and then wait for 50 years from now when they look back on us and judge us as completely regressive? The same way we do with generations that have gone before us on issues that they got completely wrong? It's the best that secular culture can provide, because what we have as the church is a God that was before all things and made all humans in his image, and that unequivocally announces that we carry dignity, sacredness, and value and worth, and any way in which any human lowers any other human, male or female, or any cultural definition you want to bring, is a violation of God himself. We can say that it's sin, that it's absolutely wrong. We can even call it evil, and we have language with concreteness to it because, God. God, this is how he's wired the world. He's the first cause. He's the one that's designed it all. It's where values derive from. Human rights don't simply exist in the ether, in the abstract. They're given by God. And it's our recognition of that sometimes can agree with culture about what those rights are, but the fact that we have a foundation of those rights means it doesn't change just because we have a different feeling. It doesn't change because there's a charismatic leader that can communicate something different. It doesn't change because the times change. There's something true about Genesis 1:27 throughout all times and ages that we get to rely upon as if it's a rock that we get to build our lives and families and societies around, other than just the shifting sands of human opinion and philosophy. We're made in God's image. Now, when sin enters the world, it immediately starts affecting not just relationship with God that is obviously broken, but also relationship with one another. And the reason why racism, I believe, is as painful as it actually is because it's far more of a family issue than it is just a national issue. Meaning, the story of the scriptures begin with one family, and every division you see in that family eventually leads to separation and division that then becomes various nationalities and cultures throughout the world. And so if you want to just rewind the tape on any hostility that exists in the world, at some level, at some point, you're going to find family dysfunction. And family dysfunction is the worst dysfunction. It is the worst. It is the worst level of animosity and hatred and prejudice or whatever else that you might have for another human being. You find that often inside your own families. And this is why the scriptures describe it can be so intense, because the histories of it actually go back to something very, very intimate. This isn't just an other. This is someone at some point that represents like a close-knit intimacy, or a brother hated another, was jealous of another, did something wrong by another, and things fell apart. Now, God didn't want to throw the world away, and so he wanted to restore it and renew it all. And the way that he was going to do it was through the nation of Israel, or the family of Israel, the first of which was Abraham. And here's the promise he made to him. He said he was going to bless Abraham, thus restoring Abraham's relationship to God. But through Abraham, he was going to make him a blessing to all the other nations of the world and essentially restore his relationship to the nations through Abraham. That God was going to work through the one to eventually reach the many. Bless the one to eventually bless the many. And the whole purpose of God in this, the mission of God, was not just to rescue Abraham or his family, but to rescue all nations, all peoples, the whole world. That was God's original intent from the very beginning of the story. The problem was that Abraham's family, like all human families and all humans, had this narcissistic tendency to make everything about themselves. And so every good thing that God does for Israel and Abraham's family, they just assume is for them. And so they forget that it's meant to flow through them, and that all the relationship and the covenant and everything else good that God does for them is not about them. And their failure to cooperate with God in his mission to reconcile all the nations back to them led to all kinds of awkward hostilities until the arrival of King Jesus, who walks in the fulfillment of many prophecies that had come since the time of Abraham that said things like this, like in the book of Joel, that said God, even though the nation of Israel was not cooperative, still wanted to pour out his Spirit on all people. Everybody. Not just a select few, not just the religiously interested, not just those who were spiritually minded, not just those of one color, type, or ethnicity. He wanted it on everyone, pouring out his Spirit, intimacy of love, relationship present with all nations and all people. And though Israel failed at that calling, there was a faithful Israelite who fulfilled it. That was Jesus of Nazareth, who came as the God of Israel, God in human flesh, lived the life that they were meant to live and failed, and then died the death that we all deserve to die in our place, sacrificing himself not only for our sin, that we might be forgiven by God, but also that he might now again include all the nations back into God's family and reconcile us with one another. Which is why the cross is it's such a powerful, powerful thing that happened not only in history, but even the very concept of it is so radical. You can even think of it in the shape of the cross itself. We actually have one in our building for the first time in like a long time, which is kind of cool. But think of like the vertical and the horizontal beams, that what Jesus accomplished on the cross was in the vertical sense reconciling us to God, but in the horizontal sense also reconciling us to one another. And you can't talk about what reconciliation to the Father looks like back to our Creator without the reality that, no, he's wanting to reconcile all nations, all peoples, all ethnicities back to the Father. And so the one is immediately connected to the other. Which is why just before Jesus ascended, he gave the church their mission, their marching orders in the world. And here's what he said to them. He said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Which, if you were to translate what that tangibly or practically means, he's saying, I am the true king of everyone. Which gives it a little bit more punch to the mouth, I think. I'm the true king of everyone. I'm the King of Kings. And here's the radical why that's such good news. That just sounds like an oppressor coming to colonize, but here's the radical good news. Jesus of Nazareth grew up under poverty, under the boot of oppression, and did not come to take life or even to bring judgment, but he actually first came to bear judgment, giving away his life. He didn't come to murder, but he himself was murdered. And somehow his death at the hands of the humans he created was the springboard of sacrificial love that raised his life from the dead, and now all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him, not because he dominated or conquered, but because he submitted himself all the way to the point of death. And somehow sacrificial love is the most powerful force in the universe. Again, not because some liberal bumper sticker says it, because Jesus Christ himself proved it. And the resurrection is the historical event that stamps it as positively affirmative. You don't upgrade on the love of Jesus Christ given away for us on the cross. You don't upgrade from that. You can't shift it, you can't redefine it, you can't improve it. It's the greatest love the universe has ever or will ever see or know. And it's that amazing sacrificial love of the Creator for his creation that has now exalted him as the true king of everyone. And so therefore, Jesus says, go. Go and make disciples of all nations. And the Greek there is the word ethne. We see it translated in English as nations, but it's the Greek word ethne, which is where we get the word ethnicities from. Sometimes we read that and just think about all the geopolitical countries in the world, but Jesus' command was to go to every ethnicity. The idea is every possible sub-breakdown, cultural, ethnic, identity sort of group, go there. And the reason why he has to tell them that, to go bring the good news of Jesus everywhere, is because we will naturally, by human proclivity, just stay close to the people we feel safest with. Or, we're going to share our lives with the people that feel most comfortable, which is exactly what God's people did in the beginning. But the command was to go outside your bubble, outside your comfort zone, and make sure you go to the other. Make sure you go to those who are different. And in many cases throughout the Gospels, make sure you go very intentionally to the people that you have either racial hostility for or that they have for you. Which is why in the book of Acts, when it's recorded one of Jesus' commissions that he gave to a group of his followers, it says, I'm going to make you witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Jerusalem's the city where it started. Judea is like the surrounding county. Samaria is just this odd little spot in between, and then the ends of the earth. It's like Samaria is the very odd insertion into that kind of geographical expansion. But Samaria were the hated racial enemies of the Jews. And you know what would have been really convenient? To go to Jerusalem, Judea, skip right around Samaria, and then just go to the ends of the earth. Because easier to preach the gospel to someone in Far East Asia or way down in Southern Africa or come all the way to North America than to go to the neighbors next door who y'all got beef with. And he said, nope, you go to them. It's also why Jesus was so controversial in his day, because time and time again, though he spent all of his time pretty much in geographical Israel, he would say things to get people furious. Keep in mind, he's from an oppressed people group that have been oppressed for 400 years. And then he says things like, the Roman centurion who came for the healing. I saw greater faith in him than I've seen in anyone in all of Israel. And then he tells parables about the Good Samaritan, which we just kind of take for granted in our cultural knowledge now. But the idea of a Good Samaritan would have made everybody mad. Confused the Samaritans and made everyone else mad. And think of who your worst enemy might be. And now imagine the Son of God telling you a parable in which he's the hero, or she's the hero. And Jesus did this time and time again, blessing all the wrong people on the outside or the fringes. But it makes sense when you get to what his death on the cross and resurrection accomplishes, and also what the mission of the church then ends up being. It's not just the blessing of the insiders. It's the restoration of the world. Which is why the church gets called a lot of things, but in the book of 2 Corinthians, we're called ministers of reconciliation. Like this is how we work out who we are and what we do. That we reconcile people to God, but you can't do that. You can't even do that unless you organically start to reconcile people with one another. This is the end of the racial mission of God, is reconciliation. Not separate but equal, not division with equality, not just sort of the redistribution of resources or power, which we'll talk all about that in coming weeks, but it's ultimately reconciliation, which is going to deal with all the inequalities, it's going to deal with all the hate, it's going to deal with all the systemic issues, but God's alignment is towards relationship with him. And naturally, it's going to start to happen with others, because here's the deal. You come into a relationship with God through forgiveness, and then you start coming into God's household and realizing there's a bunch of people that ain't like you. And the first questions you start asking is, do I belong here? Or, do they belong here? It's why almost half the New Testament is written about racial reconciliation. And some of you are like, huh? What? Yeah, because you see a bunch of theological categories that meant something for them, but you don't necessarily read it in the same way. So every time you're reading about the ancient Jewish law, or you're reading about the covenants, or you're reading about circumcision, the often fun, awkward conversation we love to have in public gatherings, anytime you're reading about these things, the calls that we get for unity in the New Testament, the book of Romans was written about it, the book of Galatians was written about it, Ephesians was written about it, most of the book of Acts was written about it. Why? Because every time the gospel goes out and reconciles people to God, and now forces us to deal with our relationship with one another. If he's my dad, and he's your dad, that makes us brothers and sisters. Nuts. Okay. And we have to work it through. And it turns out there's a lot of internally wired hostility and even racism among humans that has to get worked out. The book of Romans is just one example. Do you understand the book of Romans? The book of Romans was written to the church in Rome. Rome had a very interesting history. It was founded by Jewish Christians. A Roman Caesar kicked them out of the city, and Gentile Christians took the church over. And then when another Caesar allowed the Jews back in, you had a Gentile Christian church and Jewish Christians coming back in, and both of them going at odds, saying like, hey, this doesn't look like the same church we left. To which they immediately started having arguments over, do we sing Chris Tomlin or Kirk Franklin? Or something like that. And Paul is writing a letter to the Romans for the explicit purpose of saying, hey, guys and girls, y'all, that's why I love the South. Y'all is so helpful. Y'all. We don't have a second person plural in the English, but the South has saved us. Like, y'all. Hey, everybody, if Jew and Gentile can get along in the same church, y'all are in Rome, the epicenter of the world. You can become a beachhead through which the gospel can then be advanced all the way to Spain and the outer reaches of the known world. The gospel can advance in incredible ways if you can get along. And we see all this beautiful theology. And what's the end of it all? Loving God and then loving one another. And Jesus said, they will know you are my disciples by the love you have for one another. It ain't complicated, folks. But our bias and prejudice sure make it that way. Our hostility sure makes it that way. The systemic patterns that culture has accumulated over the centuries sure makes it that way. But God is untangling this knot, drawing us to himself, allowing no sense of cultural supremacy over any other, and trying to awaken us to the reality that somehow, if Jew and Gentile, black and white, Asian, like Latino, if somehow God's people could somehow work through what it looks like to love one another and not be uniform, but be unified in King Jesus, there's an untold amount of power that the devil fears, but that heaven will release, that could utterly change the world. Which is why we get the vision from the book of Revelation of how this whole story is going to culminate, where the multitudes gather from every tribe, every language, every nation, together around the worship of King Jesus. Revelation 5 says this, there's worship going in heaven right now, proclaiming what is true about Jesus, saying, you, King Jesus, have purchased humans from every ethnicity. Your blood was the payment for not just a group, but all groups. And so the question lingering for the church then becomes, not is this a gospel issue? Because it most certainly is. It's will Jesus get everything he paid for? Will Jesus' blood only be applied to people and those like you? Will Jesus' blood stay pooled up in one small compartment of a particular culture? Or will it spread and cover and bless and heal all nations? That's the question. It's not whether this is just a distraction. This happens. This is what happens when a church decides that a multicultural expression of itself is the best worship we can bring to King Jesus. And then we have to work it through. Because you like church a certain way, and I like it a little bit different, and we see things strategically different about what our role in the community might look like, but there's something beautiful and beneficial about being in the house together as brothers and sisters. One of my favorite things that I'm most proud of about this church specifically and our family of churches every nation, this church has been around over 30 years. We're one of the only churches in town that has both employed people of color and had multiple elders of people in color. We have been intentional about trying to build this way, and every nation generally is a global movement that does this very, very intentionally. Because of that, I have 20-year friendships with people very not like me. And do you know how you get 20-year friendships? 20 years of awkward conversations, of watching political speeches and interpreting them very differently, of watching viral videos and looking at them from very different perspectives, of watching other people's tears and deciding now isn't the time to be right, but to love. To realize that I may not have to change my mind, but God has called me to soften my heart. And if I don't do that, then I'm just building the wall of hostility that the death of Jesus has been trying to tear down. There's a lot more that I want to say more specifically about Oregon, Corvallis, Oregon State University, and Grace City and its role in this whole conversation. Both our failures and our sin, as well as our vision for what I believe Jesus wants to lead us to in the future. But to answer the question, is racism a gospel issue? I don't know what Bible you're reading. This is what he wants. This is what he's going for. This is absolutely what bleeds from the heart of God. And may we not sell short everything that Jesus purchased because we get hung up on the cultural dialogue of the demonic divisiveness that wants to come in and tell us, like, no, you can't have that conversation. It'll only produce more division. No, you shouldn't really have this conversation because it's not a problem anymore. Really? That's like saying sin isn't a problem anymore. Greed, that was really a thing that happened in the 80s, you know what I mean? It's not really a thing anymore. It just morphs and evolves. And so we're aware of it, and we pay attention to it. And we make sure that we love one another well in the language of the Scriptures, so that God's family looks more like His kingdom and not the kingdoms of this world. Yes, it's a gospel issue, and we have to treat it as such. You cannot say that you love God and completely ignore the hostility between one another. It's a contradictory statement, and we won't contradict it. But we're going to have to do some work to make sure that God gets the say on what righteousness and equality and justice look like, because it's timeless, and it involves the image of God, and it's something beautiful and redemptive that's going to end up in the book of Revelation's vision. Culture gets a lot of things right, and there are some things it does not. And we must be mindful and discerning as the people of Jesus, not using that as an excuse, as many white people do, many white Christians do, to back off from the issue entirely because we see messiness there, but to lean in and bring the truth and grace of Jesus Christ into it, because this is our finest hour. This is what we are made for. This is what Jesus paid for. What else are we here for? But at the very least, to contribute to and provide a tangible example of racial reconciliation.